So during this explosion, during this flood of false news, at the beginning of the war, hundreds of false news were detected all over Europe. Quite often they were the same false news, or they were very, very similar, by organizations of the ADMO fact-checking network. And receiving this huge amount of disinformation, we had to interrogate ourselves about which were the more relevant and which were the less relevant of these false news, because we immediately understood that some false content was not particularly harmless. For example, if, and this sadly happened, the Italian television aired images of planes flying in the sky, saying these are Russian planes flying over Ukrainian skies. No, they weren't. They were from a video game. But still, it was true that Russian aeroplanes were flying over Ukrainian skies. So the content is wrong, but we are not seeing a real harm here. On the other hand, we detected a lot, of course, of false news that were very harmful because they were basically spreading the talking points of the propaganda of Russia, of the Kremlin propaganda. So basically justifying the aggression. So, for example, saying that in Donbass there was a genocide of the Russian population. And of course, we immediately checked on, United Nations data, the number of victims that was extremely low in the years of Zelensky's presidency. We checked the documents of the Organization for the Security in Europe. Both the UN and this organization have Russia inside, so they cannot be accused of being biased, that reported a strong decrease in violations of the ceasefire. So the whole narrative of there is something very bad happening in Donbass and this justified the intervention of Russia was clearly false and could have been debunked immediately. So we have to decide at some point where to focus our attention. And here is when we started developing our own concept, at least, of disinformation narratives. This one, I think, is very interesting for fact checkers because I think rely on a very solid methodology. So when do we talk about disinformation narratives? When we have a lot of single false news, demonstrably false news, with the fact-checking methodology. So you have the sources, you have the links, you have the original picture, the original video, you can see the alteration through tools and so on. So the reader must not trust us, but only it's on his or her own eyes. So this methodology about the single content is very solid and it's already well established in the fact-checking community. If a lot of single false news convey the same message, then we can talk about a disinformation narrative. So, for example, here, Zelensky is a Nazi. So we can definitely say, also because we know this being consistent with the propaganda coming from the Kremlin and the whole narrative that Russian state media is having about the war, that this is a disinformation narrative. So what's the big issue with the disinformation narratives? That they can easily overlap with legitimate opinions. So the message that a coordinated campaign of demonstrably false news can convey can overlap with legitimate opinions. Here I put in the slides an example. Zelensky is a NATO puppet. This message, again, I don't like it. I would never agree with that, but still, it's a legitimate opinion. It's an opinion. And as fact checkers, we do not check opinions. It's not our job. But if we have evidence that this message has been conveyed through a campaign of demonstrably false news, then we can say this is a disinformation narrative. And we have to be absolutely clear that this can overlap with opinions. We are not disqualifying the opinions. We are just pointing out a fact that this opinion is also coherent with a disinformation campaign, a disinformation narrative that is ongoing. So, for example, the example that I used here in the slide, Zelensky is a NATO puppet. It can be a legitimate opinion, but we detected in Italy one very despicable false news that was also published by different traditional media, so not something that happened, you know, in some cluster of conspiracy theorists or pro-Russian bloggers, but it traveled across the mainstream media. This false news was saying that Zelensky stated that he was willing to give up Crimea in order to reach peace and a peace agreement with Russia, but the Secretary of NATO, Stoltenberg, he said that NATO will never accept anything like this, so Zelensky had, you know, to change his own mind. This is all false. What happened here? In one event, Zelensky said, we are ready, we accept the idea of talking with Russia about a possible peace only if Russia goes back to the starting point before the invasion of 2022. So yeah, of course, still having Crimea and part of Donbass. In a completely different event, Stoltenberg say, the NATO position about Ukraine is always the same. We recognize the 1991 borders. Some journalists in Italy put the two things together and create this absolutely false news that Zelensky was basically offering Putin Crimea to reach a peace, and that Stoltenberg basically said to Zelensky, no, you cannot do this. And again, this is a clear example of a fabricated false news that, on the other hand, overlaps with a legitimate opinion. So what kind of early warning, what kind of prebunking could we do about a situation like this? We can say that we must explicitly say that different reconstructions are legitimate, different opinions are legitimate, saying we really believe that it went this way or that way, all of this is legitimate. Many of these reconstructions will be false, you know, with the wisdom of the day after. But we can say that from the beginning, it's very likely to circulate disinformation as in for content. So false videos or false images about the destruction of the dam. And this is what immediately after happened. So maybe, you know, when the Russians shelled the dam few months ago without destroying it, the video about that event was resurfaced and respread on social media saying that was about the destruction of the dam, and it wasn't true. On the other hand, for example, when Ukraine did some damage to the dam, it was again circulated saying this is proof that it was Ukraine destroying the dam, and again it was not true. So this is the early warning that as Edmo we published. I don't expect you to read all the text, it's quite long, but the gist of it is that we try to be very cautious because we immediately understood the understandably emotional reaction of Ukrainian part saying, hey guys, you cannot say that our version and Russia version are the same, that you know, truth cannot be told. So we tried to explicit, of course, this uneasy situation that we faced, and we focused particularly on the fact that it's the false content, the false image, the false news, the single false content that was likely to circulate. Also hoping, which is what's the sense of this kind of early warnings and operations, that if the readers, if the users are warned before seeing this information, this is much more effective. So if we tell them, hey guys, before, let's make the example of secret biolabs. Before the war, if we already tell them during the military buildup of Russia on the Ukrainian borders in December and January, and of course the first 4 weeks of February, first 24 days of February, guys, in the event of a full Russia invasion of Ukraine, be prepared to see Russian side saying that there are secret biolabs in Ukraine. This is false. We already fact-checked it here. You have these users, if they were exposed to prebunking, they are basically vaccinated against disinformation. So if we are able to give early warnings and prebunking about specific evolution of the disinformation narratives and techniques, I think this is very, very much effective. I think that to fight disinformation, we do not have a silver bullet, of course, we don't. But we have maybe many silver arrows that can do the trick. One, of course, I think is media literacy. If we teach kids already, you know, in elementary and middle school, some basics of dealing with the information on social media and online in general, this is extremely beneficial. So investing in teaching the kids is absolutely of paramount importance. Then, of course, we need to fight for having better traditional media, because I think that in many countries there is a despicable porosity of traditional media to disinformation. And this is something that we learned during the pandemic, that if the disinformation stays in the bubbles on social media, in the clusters of conspiracy theorists and fringe movements, okay, it's not good, but the effects are not particularly catastrophic. So, for example, during the pandemic in Ireland and in Portugal, they had 99% or something of the vaccinated people, that vaccinable people that actually got vaccinated. And in both countries, we interviewed our colleagues asking why of this huge success. They both highlighted the role of traditional media and politicians in not, you know, using the vaccination campaign as a topic of political polarization. On the other hand, Romania and Bulgaria, they were the two countries with the lowest vaccination rate. Two very important factors that were underlined were exactly the role of media, traditional media, and the role of politicians in bringing this disinformation content and narratives in the houses of every Bulgarian, every Romanian. So not only, you know, the ones already in the bubbles and in the cluster, but basically the whole public opinion was exposed to disinformation. And this, of course, created a lot of negative effects. So yeah, fighting for having good and reliable traditional media and accountable politicians. These are very, very important things. Then again, of course, the pre-bunking and the debunking are both very important. About pre-bunking, it's absolutely true what you said, Loredana. It's very trendy right now. And this also creates some concerns, at least for me, because I don't want, in particular, social media platforms, but also other, you know, big actors, institutions, and companies to use pre-bunking basically as a way to definance the fact-checking organizations, because they think that debunking is cheap, it's cheaper, and it's less labor intensive than debunking. But this is true only if you do, honestly, a quite shitty pre-bunking, because if you stay on very general topics, on very general techniques, then pre-bunking is not very effective. If you want to have it effective, it must be, if not but day by day, almost week by week. It needs to follow very closely the evolution of the disinformation narratives. It needs to be informed with facts. So the work of fact checkers is absolutely of paramount importance. And in that case, you can have a very good pre-bunking that is effective. If you have this very loose and generic pre-bunking, like the one that some platform is already doing, this, I fear, won't be particularly effective in the fight against disinformation. So we need to have, of course, a very good pre-bunking, and then, of course, also debunking, because some scientific studies are telling us that the users, when they interact with the work of fact checkers debunking false news, they receive some good influence from it. So even if it's not, you know, again, a silver bullet, I think still that our work is very, very much relevant. And honestly, I would have given a different answer 5 years ago, but the pandemic and the war in Ukraine kind of changed the situation. So as fact checkers, our independence from any governmental body is of paramount importance. So we should absolutely not work for governments or parties or whatever. If we have full transparency, we can cooperate with them on specific issues. So, for example, if during the pandemic the health ministry of Italy contact us asking, hey guys, can you help us in creating an information campaign against the circulating disinformation, if we can be absolutely transparent on all the aspects of that cooperation, then we can say yes.